On this episode of Skeptiko, Ancient Aliens Debunked filmmaker Chris White.
Here's what Ancient Aliens, the TV show, says is one of the most overwhelming bits of evidence for the ancient alien proposition, and that's the site of Pumapuka and the ruins there. And that's the first one you start out and you say, hey, they say that's the best, let's look at it.
The ancient astronaut theory will suggest is that these angles are too perfect and the stone cutting is too amazing to be anything that any ancient peoples could have done. The stonemasonry there at Pumapunku is not difficult to do. And for example, they say that these stones are granite and diorite, and therefore they're too hard. And not only is that not true if they were granite or diorite, but they're not granite or diorite. They're red sandstone and andesite. I would say that if you understand Buddhism, you would understand that none of them are claiming to have done the very thing that Christianity starts with. I think it's dangerous when we say, oh, well, we know that these people are just as good, but I think that you can analyze the very tenets of what they're trying to do.
How many Buddhist monks have you encountered and really sat down and experienced and talked to?
It's really not about the individual. It's about what they are claiming, that any Buddhist would claim.
How is it not about the individual? It's only about the individual.
Because no Buddhist has reached the very thing that they need. It's getting to nirvana. Suffering is caused by tanha. Tanha is sin. It's our desires to do bad things that we don't want to do. That's the reason that any Buddhist is trying to do the ascetic practices. That's Buddhism.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and if that intro to this episode threw you a little bit, well then hold on to your seat. You're in for quite a ride. Fascinating interview. Let me avoid editorializing too much. Let's get right to my interview with the creator of the very excellent movie, Ancient Aliens Debunked, Chris White, who just happens to be an evangelical, conservative Christian. Here's Chris White. Today we welcome filmmaker, radio host, and podcaster Chris White to Skeptiko. Chris's latest documentary, Ancient Aliens Debunked, has caused quite a stir among ancient alien believers, as you might expect, as well as skeptics and even evangelical Christians, as Chris himself is quite public about being a conservative Christian. There's a lot here to unpack, and Chris, I'm really glad that you're joining me today on Skeptiko to do just that. Welcome.
It's great to be here, Alex. I'm really excited about this interview. It's a really unique opportunity, and looking forward to it.
Well, that's great to hear. I have to start off by telling you, I really think you've done an excellent job with this film. Very compelling, very convincing, and for a internet, YouTube-based documentary, which I guess it essentially is, it comes across as so much more. It comes across as a really polished, finished product. And I also have to say that, when I was just saying it's very convincing, I was someone who followed the Ancient Aliens series on TV and found myself very persuaded by a lot of the things that they had to say. And your film came along and it really kind of shook me up about some things, and you present the information in a very compelling, very well-documented way, too, where people can follow up on your claims and really judge for themselves who has the facts on their side. So, great job.
Well, thanks. That was certainly my intention was to have it be a tool for people like myself, originally believing the Ancient Aliens thesis, and basically just being a way for people to sort of hear the other side of the story. That was really the purpose of it. And it took quite a while to do all the research, and there were some things in the research that I certainly was learning too. So it's not like I just knew all this stuff right out of the gates. It actually was a product of a great deal of research as well.
Interesting. Tell us a little bit about that process. How did the film come to be?
Well, it actually started, this is something that I've been talking about in various ways for a few years on my podcast and so on. And a lot of times people would write and say, hey, either I believe this or a friend or family member believes it. Where should I go to learn more or to help them with it? And a lot of times I would point them to people like Dr. Michael Heiser, who appears in the film and whom I know that you have had on the show. And he's got sitchiniswrong.com and a few resources that kind of dive into it, but there really wasn't an easy button, as I've been calling it, to where you could say, hey, here's a comprehensive debunking of the main ideas of the ancient astronaut theory. So it really, like a lot of things I do, it's just born out of necessity, more or less, to be a tool. And it needed to be something I wanted to put it in a form on the website where it's written, it's also sourced, something that can actually be a genuine tool for others that want to expand further on it.
Right. And what's the reaction been? There's been a ton of publicity. You have Joe Rogan, you have other kind of pseudo-celebrities pinging it, a lot of skeptics pinging it, and a lot of views, right?
Yeah, it's doing really well, certainly better than anything else I have done. There's a lot of interest in this topic, and I chalk most of that interest in the film up to just an inherent interest that people have in the topic. But yeah, there's been a lot of mixed reviews and a lot of stuff that I would expect, some diehard, ancient astronaut theorists, and as well as you mentioned, the skeptics. And really, it's all across the board. It's actually not as bad as I would have thought in terms of people actually challenging some of the strong points that I made. And I was actually really interested to see, of the criticisms, were there going to be any things that I was, because I'm sure that it's a 3-hour movie. There's a lot of research in it, a lot of detailed stuff. I was sure that I was going to get something terribly wrong, and that would be all sort of flushed out in the criticisms of it all. And in regard to the ancient astronaut theory and the debunking of it, I've been pleasantly surprised that there hasn't been anything detrimental to any of the topics. So I've actually, in terms of actual good criticisms, there's been a few things, but mostly it's been standing up pretty well.
I agree. The first thing I did was go and Google the debunking of the debunking kind of thing, and I found a couple of folks who were featured in the film had responses, but not a lot. I mean, a little kind of nibbling around at the edges, but the basic thesis that you put forward, and it's more than a thesis. The facts that you build one on top of another, I didn't see anyone really knocking those down in any substantial way.
Yeah, the best was by Philip Coppens, who unfortunately recently passed away by a very aggressive cancer really recently. So I'd certainly want to pay him respect and not say anything disrespectful here. But he did a really good, I'd say the best comprehensive sort of debunking of the various facts, and and I actually refuted that debunking. So there's a debunking of the. You get the idea. It's on the website, my response to Philip Coppens. And I would suggest that if anybody has seen that one, to see my response to it, because I find that many of the things that he said were just not true.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really want to encourage folks to go to ancientaliensdebunked.com and watch the film. It's 100% free, commercial free, no promos for anything else. But I also want to give folks just a little bit of a sense for the kind of information that you talk about. Maybe one we could start with is the one that you start the film with, because, and I love the way you just deal with this. You say, okay, here's what Ancient Aliens, the TV show, says is one of the most overwhelming bits of evidence for the ancient alien proposition, and that's the site of Pumapuka and the ruins there. And that's the first one you start out, and you say, hey, they say that's the best, let's look at it. Take us through Pumapuka and how that's debunked.
Well, this one is one that I spent a lot of time on, reading a lot of papers from archaeologists and so on at the site. And it's basically part of a greater complex called Tiwanaku, and it's some people would argue that point, and they do so because of a sort of old school ancient Eric von Daniken, who is sort of the guy who mostly started the ancient astronaut theory. He basically tries to distinguish between Tiwanaku and Pumapunku for his own purposes, but It's part of a site there that basically has some really interesting stonemasonry. These are the famous H blocks that are often seen that look like big stone H's. The main thing that the ancient astronaut theory will suggest is that these angles are too perfect and the stone cutting is too amazing to be anything that any ancient peoples could have done. We could talk about what the site actually was and so on, but the main thing is that the stonemasonry there at Pumapunku is not difficult to do, and there's lots of things that they say are true about Pumapunku that are not. For example, they say that these stones are granite and diorite, and therefore they're too hard. And not only is that not true if they were granite or diorite, but they're not granite or diorite. They're red sandstone and andesite. And they are not as heavy as they say they are, and they're not as in the right angles as they say they are. And one, I think, important point about all of this is that the culture that built Pumapunku was relatively recent. I mean, by all archaeological dating methods. I mean, there's a lot of ways to date sites like these, and when you try not to take one particular way, but try to take as many as you can and see if they all are adding up to get a sort of an idea how old something like this is. And the culture, we know the iconography there. It's Mama, which is something that is known about, and it's again dating the place. But what I'm trying to say here is that it's relatively recent at a time when metalworking at that area in South America was really well done. They were doing great things with metalworking. They were casting strong copper and alloys on site. These are alloys that are usually part of a local ore that already came sort of pre-alloyed, if you will, that they probably chose because they made stronger tools. But all this to say that these tools that they were casting on site, or at least they were casting these brackets and things that were part of the site on site, were more than enough to do what we see in the stonemasonry at Pumapunku. And the things that they say are impossible, things like these holes in the side of they're not impossible. They would just require some pretty basic drilling techniques that existed 1,000 years or more before this in Egypt, and that we see being used all over the place. Things like a Egyptian bow drill kind of thing. It could be any number of things, really. But that's basically the idea, is that it's not, it doesn't require alien technology to do this stonemasonry, and it's actually quite mundane when you get into the details of how they made like flat surfaces on stone and that kind of thing.
What I really like is the way you support that claim is by showing some of the other archaeological finds there that you don't see in the Ancient Aliens series. And that really made me question how they were presenting the facts. What you do is you show some pieces of stone that are kind of in process of being finished. And you make the case that, well, look, here we can even see where they're making these stones into the finished product. And then you also say, as you just mentioned, where they were casting iron. And again, if this is at the site, it makes you wonder why the producers of Ancient Aliens didn't factor that into their equation. And it really makes a strong case, I think, for what you're saying, which is that it's a slanted view in order to advance a certain theory, and that theory is the Ancient Alien theory.
Certainly, and I'll just add to that what you said about the importance of those stones that are in the process of being made. That is such a consistent thing in ancient stonemasonry, in the quarries of all these places. It's one of these things that I do think there's one interesting thing is that it seems that stonemasonry, ancient stonemasonry in all these different parts of the world seem to be done essentially the same way, whether it's Easter Island, all the sites in Pumapunku, even Egypt, and other places where they're making flat surfaces, they all do it the same way. They start out with these sort of trough-like depressions made by a harder pounding stone than the rock that they're working with, and then they finish it off with either grinding tools. And sometimes they'll do it in a way that I wish I had presented in the film, because it's evident at Pumapunku and other places and Egypt, is they would drill holes and then put saturated wood in there and in this line, and it will form this crack and break off a side, which they would then polish. But anyway, yeah, that's a really important part, and it exists in just about every culture that is working with stones to the magnitude that they were. Great
stuff, Chris. So your film, Ancient Aliens Debunked, has also gotten a lot of traction from the skeptical community. Not too much of a surprise that they would latch on to this, but what has that experience been like for you?
Well, that's an interesting question. The skeptic community has been, well, they were supportive initially. I felt like they all, I really actually tried to, like, for example, Skeptic.com posted the video on the front page of their site, and in fact asked me to do an article, which I think is coming out in the next Skeptic. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, I tried to warn them before doing this. I said, look, you're going to get a lot of heat from this because I'm a Christian, and I think it's just better if you don't. And I said that, and honestly, I've turned down other interviews because people weren't aware when they were asking me for interviews that I was a Christian. And so I knew what just based on what happens when people post it on a skeptic site and they're like, what are you doing posting this Christian, da 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 da. And so I'm trying to say, look, just so you know, I'm a Christian and this is going to be an issue, or whatever. But if Skeptic.com was one that was saying, look, whatever, we don't care. Now they did put out a article after that, which is essentially challenging the main sticking points that they had, which were my stance on the Nephilim and particularly the flood myths of ancient legends, which I essentially said, hey, look, that's probably based on some actual event rather than just a copying of text and so on. And so that was the main thing. And I really tried to, well, before we get into that, just to answer your question, I think that I really like the skeptic community in that I think that they're ostensibly trying to look for the truth, but I feel as though, and I'm sure you would agree to an extent, that there are a lot of presuppositions in the skeptic community that really prevents them from doing their sort of main job, which is to find the truth wherever it leads. That being said, I'm not saying that I'm right on everything that I said or anything like that, but I do think that the skeptic community is beneficial, and it's something that I consider myself a part of to a degree. A lot of the things that I do are debunkings of nonsense and new, it's just random stuff. So I consider myself somebody that likes to be analytical and debunk things. And so in some sense, I feel a kinship with the skeptic community, even though I'm sure that they would not claim me in any way, shape, or form.
Sure. No, I can understand. And I think anyone who's critically, analytically minded feels a kinship with the ideals of the skeptic community as it's come to be known. But my experience with the skeptic community is that they're completely not upholding those ideals. I mean, Michael Shermer, great. He published your thing and did an article on his website and in his magazine. But I find them to really just be apologists, more or less, for scientific materialism, which, let's face it, is really kind of a cover for atheism. I mean, the thinking always starts with one conclusion. That's we're biological robots. There's no soul. There's no free will. And then it's all just working backwards to only look at data that fits into that conclusion. So I just don't find them being open-minded and critical thinking in that way. So I don't know. The kinship is there, but I also see this just complete undermining of their values. I mean, they're kind of putting out one thing and really doing something else.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that, because it seems as though to me, and this is from the outside looking in, is that it's almost like whatever it is that's mainstream, like if the news reports on it, that's what we're going to defend,
Right.
Like, hey, the news says vaccines are good, and I don't know where you stand on that stuff or that kind of stuff, but there's like, so we have to defend that it's good or whatever. It's like it's like they're just supporting whatever it is that is mainstream. And I know that in the skeptic community, and I've heard certain skeptics make reference to this, that like every skeptic has something that isn't accepted that believes something that isn't accepted in the skeptic community. And I would suggest that there's probably a lot more of that going on in the skeptic community, but it's almost like this sort of, they can't talk about it or do much, about it because there's just such a strong sort of, you can't do that because that doesn't fall in line with the party.
I completely agree. I mean, and that gets into a whole conspiratorial aspect of it that I think is very real and has to be looked at in a very serious way, whether you come to the conclusion that it is in fact conspiratorial or not. I think it needs to be on the table, and that's that how can this group keep coming to the same conclusions over and over again that maintain the status quo? I mean, we know that the status quo isn't always right, so, how can we keep coming to that? Vaccines is a great one. We won't get into it here, but, I mean, if you just look at the character assassination that was done and where the facts really fall at the end of the day, there's many, many cases. I mean, I think you can look at climate change as another one, or I should really say global warming, because that's how it started and it moved into climate change. Those are way off topic for our discussion, but I think what is relevant, I want to emphasize your point because I totally agree with it, is if you are a part of that community, you do have to step back and say, when do we ever step out against the status quo? And since we don't, and maybe I being manipulated by some other agenda here? I don't know. I just think it's something that should be on the table, but isn't often on the table.
Agreed.
So, Chris, your Christian beliefs have also become a hot topic of conversation as it relates to the film. Again, to emphasize to people, this is not a Christian-oriented film. It isn't making a case. It isn't evangelical in nature. But at one point, you do come to talking about the flood mythology, and you make reference to the Noah's Ark, and is that being confirmed by nautical engineers? And then if anyone, you're a pretty open guy out there, you're very public, if anyone just pursues that at all, they find that you're a pretty darn conservative Christian. And I guess you're supportive of the idea that the Noah's Ark story has a realness to it, and process that. I mean, you got to understand, right? I mean, if people are astounded when they learn that you think a 500-year-old man built this big boat, loaded it up with all these animals from around the world, and cruised the oceans for a year, it's hard for a lot of people to swallow that.
Well, I mean, certainly we could talk about Noah's Ark, and that's certainly something that's come up a lot. The thing is, I think that there's a lot of general sort of presuppositions about this, and comes from like Sunday school version of Noah's Ark and things like that. But the text is actually quite technical about Noah's Ark, and it explains a lot of these things that I think that the issue is very defendable. There's been a good paper, it's often referenced, called the feasibility study for a lot of things like that, like the different animals, how could you get them on the ark, and so on and so forth. And I would actually take a bit different view in that I don't think you got to work dinosaurs into the equation, like I think is so often an unfortunate thing that has been a part of this defense. But the point is that the idea is feasible. One of the many things a BBC article thing did recently is like, you can't build a boat that big, a wooden boat that big, because it would just crush under its weight. And, there's been really good work done on that to essentially say, first of all, there isn't anybody saying that metal wasn't a part of this. I mean, even the Bible mentions that metalworking was before this and so on. Besides, I could go into the details, but I'm not sure if that's the direction we want to go here. But all these different things about the ark itself, I think, have very rational explanations. And if one takes the time to look into those things, I think that you'll at least come to the conclusion that, hey, there is a rational defense of this. Now, one of the most, the biggest things that I got was, and I think that the issue really, I didn't really even defend any of that in the movie. What I defended was the idea that it was such a consistent story over every culture, I mean virtually every culture in the history of humanity, and not just a flood story with various elements, whether it be 8 people or animals in a boat, and a dove or a raven, and all, not just little details like that are so conspicuous that we need to address them. But other things, that this flood and this whole boat situation was a result of some hybridization thing that happened, and that was why the flood was sent. And it goes even further than that. The beings that were a part of that hybridization event were locked in some sort of abyss. I mean, it's these weird, consistent things. Now, not every story contains all of those elements, but there's pieces of it in all of these stories. And what I was really impressed with, when Skeptic actually wrote an article saying, hey, look, we don't have to deal with these stories. They highlighted, for example, the Chinese flood myths. And I was impressed with Jason Colavito, who's also a skeptic and certainly an atheist or agnostic. I'm not sure where he stands, but he's certainly not a Christian. But he wrote back and wrote another article saying, look, skeptic.com just totally blew over this ancient Chinese flood myth. And he pointed out, look, this really is a connection. There really is you can't just simplify this and say, oh, it's just a flood. We don't have to worry about it. He was saying that there are really consistent things and it really did happen. And at the end of the article, essentially saying to the skeptic community, look, I don't believe, Chris in this regard or whatever, but these things are real and we haven't come up with a good explanation for them. And the problem, Alex, is that when you start to look at the similarities in mythologies, which was the whole point that I made in any of this, my point on the ancient flood myths and my point on the Nephilim, is that it doesn't fit any pattern that anybody's ever presented as far as the nature of civilization. No model makes sense of this. So they have to argue, oh, these similarities don't really exist. They're just sort of kind of similarities. It's an accident. They have to argue a bunch of things that don't actually work if you've been in the mythology. Because the deeper you dig and the older you go in the mythology, it becomes clear, no, this is really something that is consistent. I mean, it's the same story. And what I suggested is that the best logical explanation of that evidence, if this is true, that these cultures in different areas of the world, as diverse as the Americas or China and Africa and Europe, etc., if they really are saying the same thing, and then the migration, therefore, we have to say, okay, they migrated back to a certain point where they must have been evolved enough at that point before the migration to all look at this, whatever, even if it was just a written text or mythology that wasn't based on fact. They had to look at that text and say, okay, yes, let's all go teach our grandchildren that this is what the history of the world. And they taught their grandchildren and children that absolutely as if it was true for the rest of the generations, that when they were asked, hey, how did we all get here? What's the story of civilization? Oh, I'll tell you. There was once this flood, and at the end of the flood, some people came out, and da-da-da-da-da. That's what everybody's telling everybody else all across the world. Now, that's the philosophical situation that we're in. And until somebody starts to, stop saying that they don't exist, and admit that they do, then we can start having a rational discussion with skeptics and everybody else. But at this point, we're in really the dark ages of people owning up to it. Nobody's challenged me on this. They've only said, hey, all you cited on this were, Christian apologist sites, and I can't look into that because it's a Christian apologist site. Well, okay, maybe it's a Christian apologist site, but they are citing evidence there. They're pointing you to the different mythologies and all the different places. You can go look at those mythologies and you can report back and say, oh, I looked at them and they don't exist. But that's not what you're going to find. And anybody that actually does this work and is in deep in the mythologies is going to come up, like, you can take anything. I was just looking at something recently, the Aboriginal drawings that look like gray aliens. That is the same story. It's, there was a flood, there was a boat, there were these angels, and they did this, hybrid thing. It's the same thing. And this is in Australia. The Aboriginal thing that's supposed to be like the oldest thing, whatever. So we gotta wrap our minds around this, and then we can come up with something. And I couldn't, in good conscience, this, as you mentioned, it's not a Christian film, but if I'm trying to reach out to ancient astronaut theorists, they know this stuff. The only reason, in my opinion, that the ancient astronaut theory ever existed in the first place is because they were dealing with this truth first. They had to say, okay, this stuff exists. It was aliens. That's about as simple as it gets. And then they came up with a whole bunch of other stuff that they just piled on top of that. But if I didn't address these ancient mythologies and their similarities, I would not have debunked the ancient astronaut theory. And so I couldn't leave it out, and I knew it was going to get everybody mad and everything else, but I had to be honest. And I think that a person who can do that, regardless of the consequences, is going to ultimately, in the end, sort of draw out better discussion from people than would be if I just left it alone.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And I agree that it was the right move because it's where you're coming from. And to not misrepresent that, but to put that out front, I think is not only brave, but as you just mentioned, I think it advances the dialogue. So in that spirit of really kind of directly addressing that, I'd like to kind of step up and take it from a slightly bigger picture perspective, because over the last few years on Skeptiko, I've had a chance to interview a lot of really well-credentialed people, people who have all the right degrees or in all the right positions, and then you push them and you find out they wind up believing a lot of pretty strange stuff, or stuff that you can pretty quickly find is not supported by the best evidence we have. And I think a lot of atheists would fall into that category. For anyone who has listened to this show, you can probably know some of the cases that I'm pointing to. So this whole issue of why we believe what we believe is very interesting to me, and I think it's central to the ancient alien theory, to the Christian apologist kind of line of reasoning, and to the consciousness, extended consciousness, supernatural stuff that we've spent more time on. I think it really is at the core of it, because it really is about belief. When we were talking a minute ago about Michael Shermer and the skeptical community, I could give you example after example where they're confronted with just the kind of evidence that they say they want, peer-reviewed studies, top doctors, and they just either deny it, twist it, or ignore it. And that comes up over and over again. So I like that you're willing to push out there with stuff that you know is going to be unpopular, you know is not going to gain you a lot of fans, and yet you want to advance that. So let's push into that a little bit. And I guess I have to start by saying that the problem I have with a lot of the things that you say about the flood myth is that, again, it seems to immediately go into this apologetics mode, which is, if I just had to listen to the last part of what you were saying about there's this common mythology and you can point out the different mythologies and all the rest of that, I'm nodding my head like, okay, great. But I know where you're going with it. I think I do. And I think where you're going with it is that these books that you have, that we call the Bible, are therefore the only books that we should rely on for understanding our true nature, for understanding our relationship with anything divine, anything more, God, I guess is what we'd say. And I just think when you really break that down, it just doesn't fly. And I think that that's borne out in the statistics. A recent phenomena of the internet is this idea of crowdsourcing, and that the crowd really knows more than the eggheads in a lot of topics. And I think obviously that's sometimes true, sometimes not true. But I think it is true. And I think if you look at what the crowd says God, yes. 90% say yes. Heaven or an afterlife, again, a huge percentage of the population says yes. But you move in and say, is this one book that we have the sole source of knowledge about that God? The statistics go way down, and a vast majority of people say no, that just doesn't make any sense from all the different data that we've pulled together. So isn't there some wisdom in that? How can we really fit our worldview and back it into this idea? These fragments of books that we found are really the sole source of all the knowledge we ever need to know about God.
Well, there's a lot of things there. First of all, I would say that in terms of epistemology, how do we know what we know? And this whole thing is about truth, and that is the bottom line. There is no other pursuit. And if something isn't true, then you shouldn't believe it. This idea of faith, blind faith, is not a concept in Christianity. It's a modern concept that skeptics of Christianity put on Christians. The Bible doesn't want you to believe anything that isn't true. Paul says, look, we of all men are most pitiable if this isn't true. Christianity is a belief based on things that you can test, things that are empirical. I think that you could sympathize with this, and having a worldview that a lot of people that claim a very scientifically sound worldview would snub at, and you're saying, hey, no, look, I've looked at this, I've talked to the people, this is something that is real. You can be empirical about this, you can test this, and there's something we need to deal with here. And the only difference between essentially your plight there and mine is that we've both looked into our respective fields more than each other. We have presuppositions about the ones that we haven't looked into. The idea of the Bible being, the one set of truth, when you ask people about this, and I've certainly found this, the main thing out of somebody's mouth is something to the effect of, we can't trust those books. They've been written over and over by men, and they've changed so much. And I find that people really have no concept of what they're even trying to argue about there. The idea that they've changed so much over time is something that you can test with great accuracy. I mean, if they have changed so much over time, as just about virtually everybody on the street will tell you that they have, it would be the easiest thing on the planet to prove. Because there are copies, manuscripts of the Bible from different time periods in different continents that agree within, what is it, like 99.5 or something degree accuracy. That's astounding. No, I'm not claiming the truth of that yet. I'm just saying that, hey, look, that we must agree that these things haven't changed over time, and that was just a starting place. But
let me just try, and I don't want to go down that path necessarily. I mean, we could. It's interesting to me, but I kind of wanted to redirect it in another direction, not to cut you off, but to get your opinion on this, because it's something that we touched on in our email exchange, and I think it's really an interesting point that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that's the supernatural hypothesis, So we had a little bit of email exchange back and forth, and at one point you said, hey, I think a lot of the criticisms against Christian apologetics is based from this kind of non-supernatural perspective, basically scientific materialism. It starts with the assumption that there can't be anything supernatural, therefore, so they're kind of doing apologetics on the other side, is that, hey, you've never seen anything supernatural in your life, have you, folks? And everyone's thinking, well, yeah, I have, but they're nodding their head, yeah, there's nothing supernatural. And then from there, they go, well, then how can you trust any of these things that these people are telling you? I want to go down that path. And because it's something that doesn't get talked about. So let's assume the supernatural, if you will, because in the work that I've done, in terms of consciousness, parapsychology, near-death experience, out-of-body experience, wherever you look, you find what you could call supernatural. I think it's a natural fact that we have to deal with. I know that's a contradiction in terms, but the evidence strongly suggests that this does happen. But if we incorporate that in, how does that fit into then your worldview? Because it seems that Christians have as big a problem with that part of it as they do with kind of overcoming the skeptic who says, no, nothing supernatural could ever happen.
Well, I think that the baseline here, again, is still epistemology. How do you know what you know? If something is supernatural, and I would certainly agree with just about everything that you're studying and have on the show, that they exist and there's a real phenomenon there, that's really not the question. Whether or not it is existing, and I think probably one of the reasons we are all sort of struggling about what is true is because we tend to find something supernatural that happens. Hey, wow, this supernatural thing is genuinely real. Hey, everybody, come and look. Everybody see this supernatural thing is genuinely real. And they sort of give it or presume that whatever theology is presented in that supernatural context is therefore true. Just because it's supernatural doesn't make whatever it is being true. And a good example would essentially be a lot of the channeled material and different things that happen in that regard. People can channel a genuine entity. I don't know where you're at with that. Some of the stuff in automatic writing, and you can actually see that these entities are saying something that's not true. For example, the 2012 stuff all started with channeled material, and they say stuff about the pole shift and the galactic alignment that is scientifically provable to be false, but stuff that was so difficult, so brilliant in a way to ever be borne out, to ever be found out, that nobody would ever catch them on it. I would say that there's deception in the supernatural world, and that changes how one deals with what is true. So you have to keep coming back to, well, how are we determining what is true or not?
I want to roll you back to, I think, the very first thing that you said, which was that some of this channeled material seems to be legitimate, although some of the facts of it are then contradicted by modern science. But somewhere in there you said that there's some realness to this channeled material. Did I hear you right on that?
Yeah, and I would say the same thing is true with, all the stuff that you're dealing with, the ESP phenomenon and so on, and we can go on down the line.
Well, here's the problem then, Chris. If there's some realness, to the channeled material. And I find the same problem that you do. You take these kind of amazing books that have been written. A lot of folks really are into the Seth material, and there's some beautiful stuff in the Seth material. And then there's some other stuff that's just wacky and completely contradicts what we know about modern science, modern neurology, and all the rest of that. So what do? Do you throw it all out? But I think the challenge is even greater for the Christian person. You take A Course in Miracles, a book written in the 70s, purports to be channeled or at least directly inspired by Jesus. How would we ever establish whether or not that was true, more true, less true than Scripture? And I think you wind up saying, because a lot of Scripture is essentially channeled material, more or less. And let me add this to it, because I think this is important too. What do we do with the fact that thousands and thousands of people have been inspired and drawn to a life and a relationship with Jesus Christ through some of this channeled material that you may or may not like? A Course in Miracles or Conversations with God, another bit of channeled material that seems to be very in keeping with a lot of Christian ideals, a lot of Christian doctrine, and more importantly, is personally meaningful to people. And for those people, it strengthens their relationship with Christ. How do we just throw all that out and say, wait a minute, it's not biblical, we can't tie it back to the archaeological records, therefore we have to throw it out?
Well, I think it starts with what Christianity is. None of the Gospels or the New Testament writings are anything like that. They're not just talking about good ideas about stuff. It is, Luke starts out, look, I write this to you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know for certain. I'm doing the research here. I'm going and talking to, for example, this woman who claims, and talking to all these people and researching this stuff. It never stops being exactly what it claims to be. This is Paul writing a letter to churches describing what happened to him and what's going on at that time. But the Gospels are saying, look, I was there. This is what I'm saying. There are people describing actual events. So it's really not about, hey, they wrote some good stuff. They're saying, no, look, this dude, we're going to tell you about this dude and what he did. They're saying, look, he rose from the dead and we all saw it. There were 5,000 there at that time. You guys all remember when this happened and so on. There are things that
Chris,
are empirically testable within those claims. These are claims of actual things that happen. Now, I'm just saying that based on what they are saying in terms of they're making factual claims consistently, there is hardly a page of the New Testament that isn't something that you could be like, they're either lying or that didn't happen. And so you can test it. There's various ways that you could go about testing that. Now, with regard to the channel material and say, well, they talk about Jesus and they say nice things about Jesus. And you say, therefore, that they have a relationship with Jesus.
They say that they spoke with Jesus. That's the part that, and I'm not trying to cut you off to stifle the conversation. I'm just trying to redirect the conversation. The conversation we're having right now, I haven't heard before. I'm sure other people have had it. I just don't hear it very much. And that's that you and I believe in the spiritual. Okay? So I accept not only the possibility, but the probable reality of Christ consciousness, right? So Christ consciousness is there and it's present. I accept that it's in our conversation here and that I can tap into it and I can have a relationship with that Christ consciousness, and I accept that you can tap into it and you can have a relationship with that. And I don't have to support that completely scientifically, but I can say that it's a pretty logical conclusion from just processing the data and saying, well, it does seem like consciousness is a reality. We're not biological robots, and it seems like consciousness does survive death, and there does seem to be a hierarchical nature to consciousness, and therefore God. And then I can mix in this idea that Jesus seems to be a real figure, and many, many people have experienced that consciousness. So I'm right there with you, I think, on most of this stuff. Where I don't understand the divide is when Donaldson comes along and says, hey, I connected with that Christ consciousness, and I wrote this book called Conversations with God, and I write it in the 1990s. Why not? Why can't we accept that that is a real possibility? Christ consciousness is interacting with all of us. Why not interacting with Donaldson to write these books?
Well, again, it comes down to the fact supernatural experiences don't equal truth. Everybody that has a genuine supernatural experience where some being came and talked to him doesn't mean that that being told them the truth. At the end of the day,
it doesn't mean that they
I
didn't.
think that we're in a good position here, Alex, because if we accept that there are beings in another dimension, however we quantify that, that can be a technical discussion. I don't know how many dimensions there are. Let's say there's 10. And if we interacted with them and they're in some way able to interact with us, let's say there are physical beings just as real as you and I are. Now, if we agree that they exist, then I think anthropology is one of our best tools in terms of science to figure out what their motivations are, what they're like, what their abilities are. And that becomes the most important thing in the world of everything that we could ever do right now to figure out what they're like. Because I think when you go back into anthropology, you see a consistent profile of these beings. They are summoned the same way. They are consistently referred to as evil, deceptive, very, very intelligent, have an agenda of sorts, seek and accept worship. But I think the deceptive thing is really what comes so clear from the Sumerians forward. These things will tell you what you want to hear. They are often referred to in the text as watchers, people that are observing you. They know what books you're reading. They know what to say when you have the ayahuasca trip, and they know how to just stroke exactly what you've been reading on the plane trip to Peru. They have an agenda, and unless we realize their agenda, and you're saying, oh, you're talking Christian theology right now. Well, we're talking just truth right now. If we can accept some of the basic premises that I just said, that there are beings and that people all across the world know how to summon them, and from ancient times, from time immemorial, without Christian biases, are saying the same stuff: deceptive, super intelligent, able to essentially interact with and give thoughts to and possess, and are seeking possession. Possession is not a concept unique to Christianity, and it's always negative. What I'm trying to say is, unless we have come up with a good epistemology about that phenomenon, then we should not accept all this other stuff as, oh yeah, that was the Christ consciousness. Sure, it said it was Jesus after all.
Right, but we shouldn't discount it either. And I'm glad you went into the evil category. I don't know if we can get there, but I think it's another thing that you're brave, and I just agree with you. You have to put it on the table because it clearly comes through over and over again as a consistent part of the human experience. And we have to understand that and not be afraid to go there, despite the way our modern culture wants to deal with it. But I come back to the same thing because I do think you're kind of flipping back and forth. Of course, this is going to be my perspective on it, in that it does come down to how we would test it. I'll give you another small example, and I'd love for you to comment on it. Most people who've studied the Bible know this, but when you look into the book of John, and Jesus says, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, that famous story. Beautiful story, very much in keeping with what anyone who's raised as a Christian thinks about Jesus. But then we find out through biblical scholarship that that's not an original part of the canon, of the scriptures. But for hundreds of years, it's inspired Christians. It's driven Christians to be better Christians. So what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to just be slaves to the latest archaeological discovery and the approval of some biblical scholar? That's where I say, if we just step back, don't we kind of common sense know that we're never going to get to the bottom of what was really said about this person's life 2,000 years ago? And it's always going to be wrapped in mythology and mystery and mistranslation and all the rest of that.
Well, that's exactly my point. Earlier, you say that we know that Jesus didn't say that, but do you know why they say that they know that Jesus didn't say that? It's certainly not an archeological thing.
Well, it isn't in any of the Greek translations. And those are the
sure it is. I mean, that's the oldest copy we have is of John. I mean, of the early manuscript text. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that if you understand why they're saying that, it's because of presuppositions.
I'll back off of the John thing and go research it, but my understanding of it is, and I think my source on that is Bart Ehrman, which, some people in the conservative Christian community don't like, but you have to agree is a pretty top-notch biblical scholar. And I think my understanding is most biblical scholars agree that it isn't in some of the very earliest translations. But I'm going to back off of that. I'm going to go do my independent research, and I'll add an end note where people can go and look at both sides of that. I'd rather get back to the question of, do you really think at the end of the day, Chris, you're going to wind up with this book, this perfect book that has everything you need to know about God and your relationship with him?
Let me put it like this. When I first started all this stuff, I didn't have any of this confidence in the Bible or anything. It's been, I don't know how many, 7 years now of people that are, brilliant people over 7 years sending me things like, hey, you haven't checked this out. Look at this thing or look at that thing. This wasn't true archaeology. I mean, 7 years of people. I mean, I've been doing videos and apologetic stuff for at least that long. And every day my inbox is filled with critics, stuff that I haven't heard before, and stuff that if it is true, then I'm wrong and Christianity isn't true and I shouldn't believe it. I don't want to believe something that's not true. Now what I'm saying is that I over the years of looking at that stuff and being like, okay, I have to figure out whether or not this is true. I have to go now look at this and see if this is true. Is this contradiction real or whatever? And I can tell you, after all those years, that's the reason I have the confidence right now. I mean, the only reason I would even give the Bible faith at this point is because after so many years of letting it show, like, look, I'm right about this. It continues to validate itself. I can honestly tell you, Alex, without any hesitation, that there aren't any parts of the New Testament and things that I used to think were true. I've seen the websites. Well, the news, it's not true because this thing and that thing and that thing, and it's not. All of that stuff has more than sound, logical explanations. And anybody that has those things, well, I know it's not true, Chris, because I know this one thing. Just Google that exact same thing. Just cross-reference it with an apologetic site first. I'm not saying go to apologetic sites, but at least hear what they have to say and see if it's a logical explanation. And if it's a logical explanation, then you can be like, okay, well, there's one for you, Bible, but I still got 59 that I've got, and so I'm not going to believe you. And then maybe try the 58th.
I don't find it very convincing at all. And when I listen to folks like Bart Ehrman debate Christian apologists, I think it's so one-sided that it doesn't even bear to be a fair fight. But the main, again, that's not the issue to me. The issue to me is, again, something you blew past. The Bible can be this somewhat humanly flawed document that I think it is. And it can still be the most important document in someone's life because it can bring them in relationship with God. And in my cosmology, God can be big enough to reflect perfectly that Christ consciousness for someone and bring them as far as they need to go in their development. And at the same time, God can reflect to the Buddhist follower Buddha consciousness perfectly and draw them to a path towards God. I don't see I don't see a problem with that, and I don't see the support for what you're saying that, if the Bible turns out to be something less than this perfect inerrant document, then Christianity fails. Of course it doesn't fail, because this whole thing works at a level that is way beyond what we understand. I mean, that's what we already know.
Mutually exclusive is the word that I would use in regard to that. You say that, hey, this all works because this Christ consciousness idea is saying things that are beneficial to people. But if we explore those kinds of ideas, I mean, generally it's something to the effect of, hey, once we all realize that we are innately divine and something, and we start working on that practice, then eventually we can become one with God or something like that. That's a cosmology that's a claim of fact that is completely mutually exclusive from the Jesus of the Bible, that at least has some evidence in history that he says these things. There is no evidence of history that Jesus said anything like the Christ consciousness idea, but there is things that he said, look, I am going to raise up the dead at the end of time. Me personally, I'm going to raise up everyone and I'm going to judge them. That's the kind of stuff that this guy says. Now, he says stuff that, that doesn't quite jive. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. He says, look, I have to be number one in your life. I have to be, everything else by comparison must seem to be hate. If you're going to be my mathetes, that's the word that's sometimes given to like mathetes of Socrates or something. If you're going to be a mathetes, look, you can try to be mine, but it's not going to work unless I am number one. Now, a Christ consciousness idea would never see when people suggest, oh, this is the real Jesus, they're doing so with no historical reason to do so, and they're doing so despite everything that the historical guy says the antithesis of it. And I would say that the bottom line is that Christianity isn't a bunch of rules that you follow. It's a supernatural thing that happens to a person that is measurable. And I bet, Alex, that you know somebody in your life that is kind of hard to explain, that you knew them before they were saved, and then afterwards, you might think they're not a very, whatever. They're a different person. That's what it is as being born again. That's something that actually is a real measurable thing. Their heart changes. Good, they desire good things and begin to hate bad things. It's something that is real, not a bunch of rules. And there are a lot of people that claim to be Christians that simply aren't, and that's because modern evangelism and things like that. But I won't get into that.
Well, it's funny because you've really led us back to, I think, the really hard part for me, and there's a lot of agreement in me with what you're saying, but I've just experienced through this show and through my research many, many people from all different kinds of religions and cultural backgrounds who have had these kind of profound spiritual experiences that you're talking about. And anyone can see them and see that they're changed people, and their family can see that they're changed people, that they're more loving people, that they're more connecting people, they're more godly people. And, while these experiences, those kinds of experiences, obviously fly in the face, first and foremost, with the atheist scientific materialism that insists we're all biological robots, we don't have any free will, all that stuff that they cling to so dearly. But when you really study those kind of experiences, modern day experiences with modern day scientists, like researchers have done and the kind that I've talked on this show, you also come to the conclusion that it doesn't fit into the Christian worldview either. It contradicts it in some important ways that we would test, we would predict, and it doesn't fit.
Well, it comes down to, again, the supernatural experience. You can have a Kundalini experience, and you can have whoever is telling you to do that tell you that means so on and so forth. And there's no doubt that, hey, something supernatural happened. But what did that do to you? And you could say, well, it did something great. Or you can have an experience like David Icke, and you can have these beings tell him that, he's whatever, he's going to change the world and all this stuff. But a lot of these people that I find that are claiming to be, enlightened now because they've had something supernatural happen to them, in terms of a supernatural experience, going to an ayahuasca trip or taking DMT, seeing an entity, have it tell you something cool or something that sounds good, that does not equal truth. We still have a whole bunch of criteria that we need to apply to those things based simply on the fact that, basic demonology, and I'm not talking Christian stuff, but although Christianity has a lot to say about it, the demonology is something you can get from other places, suggests that that's no great feat. Even Terence McKenna said, look, it's not a big deal to hear a voice in your head. The big deal is trying to figure out if that voice is telling you the truth or not.
Yeah, but those aren't the people I'm talking about. I'm talking about the pious, devoted Buddhist monk, Hindu practitioner, just the beautiful people that we encounter in life. I would say that's a presupposition. I would say that if you understand Buddhism, you would understand that none of them are claiming to be have done the very thing that Christianity starts with. If you actually understand what the noble truths and things. I'm talking about the product of it. I'm talking about their life, the way they live their life in a way that we can observe, and through generations.
The way that they live their life seems to us to be pious because they're not eating that much rice. They've given away their possessions. They're going somewhere and they're on this path, right?
No, it's what
we interpret as that must be good, and they're doing, they're following rules. And if you had rules like in Islam, we have a lot of views about Islam, but they have a lot of rules that says, look, give to the poor, fast, be nice to people. Those are rules that they're following because of threat of whatever. In Buddhism, it's a little different. It's a carrot on a string.
Chris?
I did a video one time that actually analyzed this, and I think you would appreciate it because it's a factual thing. I think it's dangerous when we say, oh, well, we know that these people are just as good, but I think that you can analyze not their personality. I'm not talking about whether they're good or not, but you can analyze what the very tenets of what they're trying to do. And I think very few times do people either understand Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or any of these
Chris,
things.
How many Buddhist monks have you met? How many Buddhist monks have you encountered and really sat down and experienced and talked to?
It's really not about the individual. It's about what they are claiming that any Buddhist would claim.
How is it not about the individual? It's only
because
about the individual.
no Buddhist has reached the very thing that they need. It's freedom from nirvana or getting to nirvana. Show me a Buddhist that would claim that right now. And everybody's saying, oh, well, they're saying, look, the noble truths we need to deal with, the suffering is caused by Tana. Tana is sin. It's our desires to do bad things that we don't want to do. That's the reason that any Buddhist is trying to do the ascetic practices. They're trying to eat less rice, go onto a hill, do whatever, is because they're trying to defeat the innate desire to sin, Tana. Now that's their path. And if you understand that they're hoping that one day, if they do all the right meditations and they eat the less food and they give away enough possessions and they're nice enough to people, that one day it will happen and they will be diminished in their level of desiring to sin. That's Buddhism. That's why Buddha broke from Hinduism. And I think that people don't even get what Buddhism is. They just see it in this sort of Western sort of New Age idea that, hey, it's an alternative to Christianity, but it's not an alternative to Christianity. Nobody even gets it. They're saying, hey, do this, you might get this, but it's not going to take this lifetime. In fact, we don't know anybody that's ever done it. Maybe it'll take 80,000 lifetimes. It's this big carrot on the string. It's a sham.
I would recommend Living Buddha, Living Christ by Thich Nhat Hanh, Nobel Prize nominee and a great spiritual teacher, in my opinion. But I'll leave it with what you said, and I think I don't agree with it, but I'll leave it there because you've been very generous with your time, but I want to use your time wisely. And I want to move on to talk a little bit about Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Heiser, who is featured prominently in your film. He's a biblical scholar, ancient languages scholar. And if you listen to other interviews, and I listened to the interview you did with him on your show, on your podcast, Nowhere to Run, which I would also recommend for people to check out. It's free. You can subscribe to it on iTunes, and there's some good information there as well. But in your interview with Mike, and as you mentioned before, he's a guy that I've had on this show, and we talked a little bit about that supernatural aspect to Christianity that doesn't often get incorporated into that. But when I listened to the interview you did with him, I found out that, while has these ideas about the ancient aliens and the Sumerian text, which stand up to scrutiny, he also comes across as having some pretty, strange ideas about the UFO phenomena. For example, he believes in Roswell, but he thinks it was Nazi technology that was secretly engineered by the government, and they did this kind of cover-up as a double psyop switcheroo kind of thing. I mean, again, what do you think of that? I mean, what do you think of his position on the UFO phenomena? Is that where you're coming from, that none of it could possibly be real, or what do you think?
Well, there's a lot of different aspects to the UFO phenomenon, and I would say I'm not an expert in the Roswell incident. From my understanding, there are a lot of good things to research there. There's a lot of books been written about it and a lot of real things that are, if you will, anomalies about it. I find that his explanation that it would make logical sense if this was a part of Project Paperclip or Operation Paperclip, where we took Nazi scientists at the end of World War II, and obviously that would be a bad PR thing if all of a sudden we were using Nazi scientists and they crashed this craft that was, the craft that was being worked on with the Nazis. It's a pretty standard craft. You can go look at it, predecessor to the modern day stealth technology. That if it crashed back then, especially if there were people on board and using Nazi scientists, that there would be a reason to cover it up. That's a logical explanation as far as it goes, but it's not something that I know a whole lot about. But something I do know a lot about is some of the other issues, like, and I think Heiser probably comes more from the sort of UFO kind of area, like he was interested in UFOs and stuff. So I think he has a lot more to say about that kind of stuff.
But as I understand it, he doesn't accept any reality to the UFO phenomena in terms of it being extraterrestrial, in terms of it being, from an engineering standpoint, beyond what we're able to produce here. Do you share that opinion?
Well, in terms of the craft that people see in the sky, I would say that, he would say that most of what people are seeing that's genuine craft would be black project
most
government
or
stuff.
All?
I would say that he would also probably not. I don't know about him, but I would say most. I think that there's another aspect of it that's.
So you think it's You think the other aspect of it is demonic?
Well, yeah, I think that if you go to John Mack and stuff with his stuff in alien abductions is a good place to start, because Max started doing the research, he noticed that everybody that was coming to him were pretty much hardcore occultists, to the degree that he actually came up with a form that they had to fill out called a supernatural belief scale, now revised, still used today in sleep paralysis research, called revised paranormal belief scale. It'll ask you questions: do you believe that black magic is a good thing, and all these sort of things, to quantify the fact that everybody that's having these experiences where these beings are actually torturing them and stuff like that are also people that are doing and involved with some what we would just commonly call the occult.
So there aren't any conservative Christians, Bible-believing Christians, who've had the contactee/abduction experience, as far as what you know?
No, Christians can experience a demonic attack like this. One of the projects that I do is called StopSleepParalysis.org. As a part of that is something called SleepSurvey.org. We've now had 1,300 or so responses to surveys about sleep paralysis. This is kind of an offshoot of alien abduction, and very similar. I would say alien abduction is just most alien abduction experiences are just a severe version of sleep paralysis. And one of the repeatable things that you can find is one of the things that we'll be publishing two main articles that I think are so if the scientific community didn't have an anti-supernatural bias, the articles that we're going to publish would finally put a nail in the coffin that this is in fact dealing with, or how to say it like this, that occult practices and the degree in which you practice the occult is a direct correlate to the amount of and severity of these attacks, sometimes referred to as sleep paralysis, or in the severe cases, alien abduction, oftentimes things like incubus and succubus, that is sexual violation in these. And it is an unbelievable correlate. I mean, the same people that are saying, yes, I do this, and I do this, and I channel, and I do this thing and that thing and that thing, are the same people that say, I have it, at least 2 or 3 times a week, and I'm often getting sexually violated, and so on and so forth.
How are you defining occult practices in terms of what you're talking about?
Well, you can go to the website sleepsurvey.org, and you can see there's about 90 or so questions on that survey. And one section is a great deal of occult check boxes that are varied, anything from, as I mentioned, channeling to tarot cards, or ancestor worship is an extreme version, different things like that.
What about psychic abilities?
Psychic abilities isn't a question as a term of doing something. I'll tell you this, you can't do a psychic ability, but there is a question on there saying, do you experience anything, other paranormal experiences and so on. And what we found in the other article, the second article that we're going to publish, is actually related to that in a sense, that anybody that's saying that they have had paranormal experiences, including psychic phenomenon, from an early age, that we in the survey we've determined, I think it was 8 years old and under, just sort of an arbitrary number, but basically trying to find anybody that either says I've had this since X amount, or something like I've always experienced this. If a person checks that box, or in some way says, I've been experiencing this or similar supernatural phenomenon since an early age, they will almost 100% of the time, and this is 1,300 surveys, individuals, almost 100% of the time, they will check a box that says either my parents or grandparents were involved in the occult, or my parents or my parents and grandparents were involved in some fraternal organization like Freemasonry, which I can explain why that is often a correlate. Or the other one that they'll check is, I don't know whether my parents or grandparents were involved in this. Perhaps they were adopted or some other thing. Now, genetic, in the literature today, they've tried to make this connection with they say it's genetic. But what this paper is going to say is it's not genetic. It's not based on genes. That's what they have to say, because they are noticing that, hey, my parent or is also experiencing this same thing. But I think what this survey does is say conclusively that it's not about their genes, because if it were, then everybody would be checking something to that effect. This is something essentially saying that there is a generational connection. And the reason is, for example, in Freemasonry, there's oftentimes rituals that the person doesn't know what they're doing in these rituals that they're doing, but essentially they're giving away a parent or grandparent has authority over their children to a certain age in the spiritual sense. And essentially these rituals are designed to give that authority away to what they probably think is some benevolent force. But that's how that realm operates. As I mentioned, they are incredibly brilliant is the first thing you need to know about them. And secondly, that they have an agenda. And part of their agenda is to get people to what we call open doors for this. Another thing that I would like to say in conclusion about this point is that in regard to sleep paralysis and experiencing these attacks, science has no explanation for it. They have no cure for it. They'll tell you there is no cure. But I can say over hundreds and hundreds of cases that there is a cure. You can stop this from happening to you for good. If you are experiencing this and you don't want to, and I can tell you, of 1,300 surveys, there hasn't been but 5 or 6 people that have checked the box that these things were good or neutral. They were all checking that they were evil. Even when they pretend to be good, just behind their smiles, you can tell they are not good and they don't like me very much. So what I would say is that there is a way out.
And of course, the way out is through Christianity.
Initially, it can be essentially calling on the authority of Jesus Christ to stop the individual attacks. The person doesn't have to become a Christian to stop the individual attacks, but they will keep coming back.
And from your research into this area, what is the relationship between Christian followers and contact with aliens?
Oftentimes it's kind of usually if a person is coming from an occult background or some other kind of thing where they had a large amount of open doors, perhaps they were doing Reiki or some kind of extreme thing of channeling. There's sort of a process where it's kind of like if a person was an alcoholic and they may be completely gone from the desires of alcoholism, but they may still have a few scars on the liver. But the good thing is that there is a regeneration process. It just takes if somebody has been super, super far down the road of occult, they may have, I kind of think of it like a porous protection that needs to be rebuilt. So generally speaking, and I would also submit that just generally speaking, a Christian can get very sporadic cases of this for lots of different reasons. For example, I've had over the, I don't know how many years, 3 cases of sleep paralysis. And the main thing is that that's the whole reason why Christians have been given this authority. Luke 10:19, Jesus gives authority to every Christian, says that the spirits are subject unto them, and he does it because he knows that they're going to try. So he's given us this massive weapon. And trust me that they are indeed, the only thing that realm is afraid of is his authority. We even see that in the Bible. They tremble at it, and they should.
Well, Chris, don't you think people are going to be frustrated again with the idea that that's the old loophole? So it's if you are Christian, have had these experiences, well, then there's something else non-Christian in your background. I don't quite understand.
Well, I mean, it like anybody that it's such a, even if somebody is for example, there was this lady who was in a witch coven, and she was getting, sexually violated on a regular basis by these things. She became a Christian. She is no longer experiencing this. It's an amazing thing for her to not be sexually violated by this entity. They're coming with great infrequency. And I'm talking about maybe a very mild thing once every 2 months. But even in that 2 months, it only lasts briefly because she now uses the authority that she knows she has. So when you're talking about, so it does sound like that. I agree. It's like, oh, well, you're saying you still get it. But no, it's not the same thing. Once it is in most cases when they're not that severe, if a person wasn't in a practicing witch coven or whatever it was, it's just the light switch is turned off. So there is that kind of correlation. It's not a mild thing.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I look forward to reading your paper. The research that I've done into it suggests that there just isn't that 100% correlation that you're looking for. And I would kind of tie it back into the near-death experience. I mean, that's as close as we can get in modern science to really look at what lies beyond that veil, beyond that door, is the near-death experience. And when we look at those accounts, universally, what people come back and say, I should say almost universally, otherwise I'll fall into the same trap, but that God is bigger than just Jesus. God is bigger than just Christianity. It comes through across cultures, across times, from people who are atheists, from people who are Christians. They're all saying the same thing. And I think similarly across the contactee experience community, which is something I'm just now getting into. There's just a wide variety of experiences there, from the spiritual, mystical to the very dark, demonic. And I think if we don't look
I think that's an important point. And look, if these things are, this is what the original thing that tipped me off to this whole thing back when I believed all this, the alien astronaut stuff, as I was just doing research into alien abduction phenomena. What are these aliens telling these people? And what I got was that's what originally made me think something was wrong, because these things came from millions and millions of miles away to badmouth some dude that lived 2,000 years ago. That's like their main focus was, hey, by the way, Jesus isn't that great. Let me tell you about how he's not that great.
That is I tell you, I've looked into it enough, Chris. That is not an overwhelming message from the contactee community.
Universally this way or that way. I'll say this. Look, I think you, as a researcher in near-death experiences, and I could probably Google, and find 10 of them right now, and would get contradictory accounts about what the afterlife is like. It's certainly not a universal description of what the afterlife is like, and I'm sure you would have to admit that.
Right.
So if we're dealing with contradictory accounts, people saying this is how it is over there, and yet they almost never, on major points don't agree, then we need to come up with a new epistemology. We need to figure out how we're sifting through that. Because if it's completely contradictory, then how are we going to resolve that with great confidence that we're doing the right thing in terms of that epistemology? So I think that it's more dangerous to sort of just take these accounts at face value without at least taking into account that there could be something else at play.
Chris, so Ancient Aliens Debunked, one thing I didn't ask you at the beginning, so how many views do you think you've had? Have you reached 1 million?
Yeah, the main upload has about a million, and right now it's 1,183,000 or so. But I've got other uploads, some that have close to 100,000, and as you said, other people have uploaded it. So it's certainly more than usual, and I'm glad for that. And I attribute that mostly to the universal appeal that the Ancient Aliens thing has. People are interested in it for wherever they are.
Well, and I think it speaks to the quality of the documentary, the quality of the facts and the information. It's hard to ignore. It's compelling, and people pass it along because they feel, like I do, a certain sense of betrayal in the producers of the Ancient Alien series, who left out this stuff that was very much available to them. So what's next? Where do you go from here?
Well, like I said, I'm going to try to get these papers done about the sleep paralysis survey. I've been sitting on this data for now a year. I've been collecting the data, so I want to get that out. I'd like to do some kind of short thing about that. Talk about not popular. That'll be one that's not popular. But then I've got a few other things that I'm working on in the back burner. But that's the main thing right now. I'd like to get that done.
Great. Well, I certainly encourage people to check out the movie Ancient Aliens Debunked, as well as your podcast, Nowhere to Run. Where else might we direct them to see more of your work?
Twitter is good. NTR1984 is the Twitter handle, and you can find all that stuff at the main website, which is conspiracyclosed.com.
Great. Well, Chris, it's been great having you on. I know we've had some real tough issues to wrestle out, but I'm glad we have this dialogue. I'm glad we can share it with other people. And of course, it's up to everyone to find their own path through this information.
Yeah, Alex, I couldn't agree more. And I love these kind of discussions. I wish I could just do this kind of stuff all the time. You are the perfect guy that I'd like to have these kind of discussions with, because we don't have to sort of deal with a lot of the other stuff, and we can get right down to what matters. And I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Thanks again to Chris White for joining me today on Skeptiko. I once again have to emphasize what a fine movie he's put together. And of course, as you can tell from the second part of this interview, that's what makes it so hard to understand Chris's rather strange worldview regarding Christianity. Again, let's be clear. Chris believes that the Bible is literally true. He believes that Noah was a 500-year-old man who built this big ship and put all these animals on it and sailed around the world for a year. That, to me, seems bizarre. It doesn't seem credible. But you know what I really got to thinking about when I listened to Chris? It really helped me understand completely logical, rational, and very persuasive about some things, like Chris is about debunking the ancient alien theory, and then completely off the rails about a lot of other stuff. And isn't that exactly what we found with atheists and materialists who have scientific credentials, who've written all these books, the Vic Stingers of the world, who can sit there and tell you how stupid religion is and can give you all sorts of good logical arguments and point out all the fallacies of others' arguments. And then when you confront him with the data, for example, like we did on near-death experience, and the same is true with Sam Harris, and the same is true with Steve Novella, they start spouting complete nonsense. Now, some of it doesn't seem as nonsensical as a 500-year-old man who built a boat, but it's the same kind of stuff. It's apologetics. It's starting with your core belief system that you will not let go of at any cost, and then it's deflecting and massaging whatever data comes your way to make it fit back into the belief system. If I wanted a better example of it, I don't think I could find it. And like I said, it's not about Christianity and knocking that down. It's about knocking down apologetics. It's about thinking inside of a box and not being willing to get out of that box no matter what the consequences, no matter how ridiculous your arguments are. So in a way, it's another step forward for me to see this play out. In another way, it's two steps backwards, because it certainly suggests to me that progress towards understanding this science that is from many different directions, pointing us towards consciousness, pointing us towards this new spirituality, is going to be very, very hard to make. Progress is not going to come easily because of Chris White, because of Vic Stinger, because of Sam Harris, and because they're all playing the same game, apologetics. Questions that I might tee up for this interview? I don't even know where to begin. I'm just going to leave it wide open. Please go to the forum or the comment section of this website and tell me what you think. And of course, the place to do that is skeptiko.com, Skeptiko. You can add your comment right there, or you can click on the forum button and jump over to the forum and join and tell us what you think there. Well, I have a number of interesting shows coming up, including a little interview we put together with me for episode 200, where I talk about the Skeptiko show. You may find that interesting. I was resistant to do it, but I really haven't had a chance to talk about the show and the history of the show, so that might be interesting to some of you, and that's coming up next time for episode 200. And I have a number of interesting shows in the hopper after that, so please stay with me as we push forward to episode 300. Okay, take care. Bye for now.